Chapter 11. The End of Sariyer. Life was by no means dull in our street. From the arrival of the first early morning suchu to the departure of the last evening yogurtju, there was noise and bustle and arguing and laughter. I used to sit in my corner window, a pile of cushions placed on my chair so that I could see the better, and watch the street vendors leading their lazy-looking mules up and down, crying their wares and shouting insults at each other. There were the aubergine sellers, the tomato sellers, and traders with great, glowing heaps of lemons, and in their seasons, the watermelon sellers and grape sellers. They would lead their mules drowsily, enormous baskets strapped on either side of the beast to display the aubergines and the tomatoes and the tender, young French beans. They would cry hoarsely to the listening houses that no finer vegetables than theirs were to be found in any part of the world. A shrill housewife would demand the price and, upon hearing the reply, would commence to abuse the seller. Perhaps even a battle would ensue, the trader and the housewife each vying with the other for the honours of the slagging match. Sometimes other housewives would join in, defending their representative. A few of the other traders would listen sceptically, and after a while the battle of words would reach such a pitch that the combatants had to search deeply into the opponent's antecedents in order that fresh fuel might be added to the fire. There was never any danger of either side running out of words, even if it meant reiterating the same ones over and over again. It was nothing to hear one of them informing the other that he was the son of a donkey, or that he was the husband of a prostitute, or the father of innumerable illiterate children. There were mild epithets against the stronger ones that could be used if the housewife really got into her stride. She usually bested the trader, for she almost always had grown sons, ready to defend her honour should he reply to her in like manner. And of course, there were always the other housewives who would think nothing of setting about the poor unfortunate seller, beating him with whatever came to their hands, whilst their children would rifle his laden baskets lying across the back of the phlegmatic mule. There were a great number of children in the street, dirty-nosed, underfed children who were tougher at 7 or 8 than many a man is at 40. Mangy cur dogs roamed the dustbins which were left outside the houses, for we were no respecters of authority in our street. Thousands of cats, all in stages of growth and development, ranged the rubble heaps and chased the rats from the sewers, and were even capable of eating each other when their hunger became maddening. Through all this wretchedness and dirt and poverty, my mother walked with her proud, firm step, and the other women eyed her suspiciously and murmured against her because she thought so little of their censure that she had torn the cafes from her windows and walked amongst them as shamelessly as a prostitute. And the small boys threw stones after her, and the men leered into her veiled face, and she passed through their malevolent ranks like a queen. She would not allow us to play in the street, for despite her destitution she retained her snobbishness. One daily exercise depended on the amount of time she had left over from her shopping expeditions. She rarely bought from the street sellers, having no bargaining capacity, and rendered shy before the cold, appraising scrutiny of the other women, who automatically crowded their doors to see what she bought and how much she was foolish enough to pay for it. She bought in the local marketplace, a street urchin, always to be found in the markets, to carry her wares in a basket slung over his thin shoulders. She would walk home before him, direct him upstairs to the smelly landing, tip him, and send him away. Mehmed and I were always given the job of sorting the vegetables into their respective places, for in those days she soiled her hands as little as possible. She hated the street and its inhabitants, their coarse humour and their impure speech. She had an almost academic passion for purity of speech. Once home, she would remove her veil, sink into a chair, and look about her at the treasures of my grandfather's day. Gradually, peace would creep back into her face again. She lived always in the past, emerging unwillingly for the daily routine. Each night saw her tranquilly sewing in a deep chair with the lamplight caught her hair or tending her nails, the curtains drawn and her face composed as though no hostile strangers lurked outside in the mean street. Her habit of going back to the past, of turning her mind ever inwards, would become perilous in later life, but none of us knew that then. She roamed around always in her memories, refusing to recognize the ever-encroaching future of penury. Money was very scarce, but still she spent what we had like water. If she thought she was going to start worrying about it, down came the shutter over her mind, and the thought was pushed into the uneasy background, along with the other unpleasant thoughts she did not want to recognize. When my grandmother frequently remonstrated about the way money was slipping from our grasp, my mother would turn the subject aside, perhaps showing my grandmother some piece of embroidery she had just completed, and the discussion on money would be dropped almost as soon as it had started. And my mother would talk vivaciously about many things, eagerly switching the conversation if money threatened to crop up again. She acted the part of a fashionable young woman of position, and began to talk of my father's return from the war. And after a time, a disquieting note crept into her thought, for she began to forget that there was any war at all, and took to mentioning names of long dead men. She would not accept defeat, but defeat crept up behind her like a stab in the dark. She planned to visit the Sariyer, animatedly promising Mehmed and me a long holiday there, but now and then a little shadow would cross her face, as though she knew she was talking nonsense, but preferred her nonsense to the unsavoury truth. The more contact she had with the outside world, the more she turned her thoughts inwards, the more extravagant became her plans. I never remember her to be demonstrative, clasping her children to her, or kissing them in moments of nearness. We never had any moments of nearness to her, but, nevertheless, she remained our only bulwark against the world, our one security. The touch of her cool, remote hand, the rustle of her skirt, or the sound of her light, emotionless voice was enough for us. These things could still all our fears or soothe away pain. As time passed, she grew more cordial to the widow below us, although my grandmother did her best to discourage this. But my mother genuinely liked the widow. She had a sort of sure instinct for human nature, ignoring the outward pattern and swooping down to discover the heart with a beautiful compassion. The rest of the street shunned the widow, hinting that she was no better than she should be. My mother, shunned and shunning, had a deep sympathy for this. She would ask the widow to come upstairs and drink coffee, ask her mature advice on the method of making clothes for Mehmed and me, or how to cook such and such a dish. The widow became very grateful for these little attentions from my mother, these subtle flatteries, and rapidly became the devoted slave of the family. She would sit with us and amuse us when my mother was out, wash us and feed us, and dandle muazes for hours on her capacious knees. She was a sort of unpaid servant, an inja and a lewd hajar rolled into one, and was, no doubt, very useful to my mother. She even took to preparing all the food for us, but this my mother put a stop to, for the widow's hands were seldom clean, and she had a habit of scratching her sparse grey hairs so that some fell into whatever she was cooking. My mother's passion for cleanliness was as great as her passion, an odd one in the old vanished Turkey, for fresh air. One morning, there was a great knocking at the door, and I heard someone asking for my mother. I called out to her, and she ran down the stairs. Then her voice cried, "Hassan!" And whilst I was wondering whom Hassan might be, she thanked Bekçi Baba for having directed her visitor here. Then I suddenly recognized the voice of the mysterious Hassan, and he was no mystery any longer, for he was the gardener from Sariyer, the gardener who must be commemorated forever because he liked small boys. My mother and he came up the narrow stairs and into the salon. Hassan greeted Mehmed and me with the privilege of a very old family servant, looked all about him and said querulously, "What is this dreadful place, Hanam Effendi?" And before waiting for any answer, shook his old white head sadly. He peered at my mother with his near-sighted eyes and said uncertainly, "I went to your house first. Such a shock I got, he grumbled. I did not know it was like that, Hanam Effendi. The news has not reached Sariyer. He paused for a long minute, still grumbling into his beard, then continued. It was Bekcha Baba who directed me to this house. Ah, dear, dear, to think of you in a place like this. And to my acute embarrassment, large tears dropped from his eyes, spilling down his ancient coat. Now, Hassan, said my mother, reprovingly, wanted she would speak to one of us children if we were too easily gave way to tears. Hassan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Ah, he said deeply and darkly, things are altering, Hanam Effendi. Nobody knows from day to day what will happen next, but to see you in a house like this, and he paused, trying to find the right words. My mother covered the gap by swiftly asking, what news of Sariyer, Hassan? The old man's eyes filled with tears again, the weak, easy tears of a very, very old man, but I could feel the laughter bubbling up in my throat like water from a spring well. My mother's eyes reproved my levity, which made me worse, so that I got quite red-faced with the effort to contain myself. But my laughter flew before Hassan's next words, which were so unexpected that they hit my brain like a series of electric shocks. The master is believed dead, Hanam Effendi, he said, then broke off to cry bitterly, unable to contain himself any longer. My mother looked over his bent head, blindly, and with a face that might have been carved of stone. Dead, she said. Ahmed dead? And frightened of her white face, I began to cry too. Mehmed followed, and pandemonium was let loose in the room. I am sure I did not cry for Uncle Ahmed, being still young enough not to fully appreciate the meaning of the word debt. And I did not cry because I would never go to Sariyer again. For that I did not know. I cried, I suppose, because Hassan cried, because my mother had turned to stone and had gone far away from us, and this still summer room. I cried on, bitterly, not knowing why I was crying, but liking the noise I was making. Even when the tears had stopped flowing, I still cried on, broadcasting my woe to the housetops and never wishing to stop. There is something so elemental, so primeval about human tears that the sound of them causes ripples and tremors to course up and down the spine and through the bloodstream, and my own tears that day had just that effect upon me. It was my mother's sharp, stinging hand on my cheek that made me cease, bringing me up short in the middle of a particularly heart-rending sob. Stop, she cried so imperiously that stop I did immediately, my mouth still foolishly open but no sound emerging. Mehmed and I were sent to the sofa in the far corner of the room, where we gulped and sniffled our way back to sanity. Hassan, I heard my mother say gently, tell me about it. How did your mistress discover? The old man made a valiant effort to recover himself, and after a moment or two began to speak. My mistress has been worrying for many months, and last week she sent me to the War Office to ask if they knew anything about my master. But they knew little there. At last, a colonel was found who said my master was believed dead. They know nothing else about him. Nothing. But that is terrible, said my mother, in an odd sort of voice, and was my father's image in her eyes, I wondered. Hassan continued, my mistress took the news very hardly, Hanam Effendi. She has not eaten for 3 days now, and her cough does not get any better. Last night she had a hemorrhage. Poor Aisha, said my mother. Of course we guessed she had consumption. Do not tell this news to the old lady, warned Hassan. The old lady being my respected grandmother, who would have been most indignant that she had heard this term applied to herself. Certainly I shall not, said my mother, but she is sure to find out. Oh Hassan, the terrible things that are happening. All the doors are closing one by one, and all the happy families dying. Oh Hassan. She covered her face with her hands, but she did not cry. This was another thing to be bottled up, to be pushed into the back of her mind, and not to be thought about, until one day the top would come flying off, and all these fearsome things leap out at her with a snarl. "It's the will of God," said Hassan simply. My mother uncovered her face and said, "A hard will, Hassan." "Do not say such things," cried the old man, forgetting his sorrow. So thoroughly scandalized was he that a woman should question the will of God. My mother ignored his remark and said, "Do not tell your mistress of the fire. Not just yet, anyway. She has enough trouble now, and the fire is over and my house is gone, and talking will not bring it back. We are comfortable enough here." Her eyes ranged around the room uncertainly, as though seeking reassurance of comfort. The old man got ready to leave, placing a basket of food on the table, and my mother began to water as I saw the contents being emptied. My mother thanked him, and he looked sad and doubtful, as though reluctant to leave, but he bowed to her, spoke a few more words, and then went shuffling down the stairs, and we could hear him muttering to himself all the way down. My mother sat in a chair, looking as if she wanted to cry, but habit was too strong in her, and she held back the treacherous tears. She sat looking into space, and presently a little smile touched her lips. I wondered what memory it was that had the power to override her sorrow for Uncle Ahmed, so strong to bring light to her eyes, and awareness of Mehmed and me, who sat watching her. "You must not say anything to your grandmother," she warned sternly, and we replied that we would not, and then she left us to continue with the work which Hassan's visit had interrupted. Mehmed immediately forgot why he had been so recently crying and went back to play, his thin, brown face sharp with anxiety, because a certain brick would not stand up on top of another. I watched him for a moment or two, then said, "Let me show you," and I took the bricks from his docile, clever fingers. "There," I said, when I had finished, "that is the way you must build them." He looked at the edifice I had erected, then patiently, one by one, he pulled down all the bricks again and commenced to build them up in his own way. The gaily painted bricks toppled and swayed in their insecure positions and fell to the floor, and Mehmed sat thoughtfully back on his heels, jabbing at them with his fingers, his little face still sharp with anxiety. I left him to it and went to examine the precious things which had been sent from Sariyer. There was a mountain of rice, a fat chicken, butter more golden than shop butter could ever be, large brown speckled eggs, and homemade bread. I pulled the brown crust from the bread and began to eat it with appetite. Sorrows there might be in the world, and in my family, but my childhood's special world revolved around a crust of fresh bread. It was inconceivable that my mother should imagine my grandmother would not find out about Uncle Ahmed's death. I prefer to say death and not supposed death for two reasons. Firstly, his death was afterwards officially confirmed. Second, the War Office of that time was in such a state of flux, so confused and incapable, in fact, that alive but missing soldiers were not infrequently listed as dead, even though they might turn up afterwards. But the War Office never rectified their mistakes, perhaps feeling that in the present state of things, most of the so-called missing soldiers would eventually be dead anyway. It became fairly obvious to the people that anyone listed and notified as supposed dead was as dead as he ever would be. But to return to my grandmother, Hassan had not long left us when she came angrily into my house, demanding coffee and reason for Hassan's mysterious visit. My mother looked astonished and inquired how my grandmother could possibly know of his visit. "I heard it," snapped my grandmother, furious because Hassan had not paid his respects to her and suspicious that my mother had been told something she had a right to know as well. My mother said, rather faintly for her, that Hassan had merely brought a basket of food for us, and having said that much, she sat looking at my grandmother as though the old lady was displaying almost supernatural powers in having known at all that anyone out of the usual had called at our house today. My grandmother sat stiff as a ramrod in her chair and demanded what news there was of Sariyer. "Oh, everything is very well there," said my mother rather hurriedly, going red and white by turns, with such rapidity that my grandmother must have wondered what on earth was wrong with her. Mehmed strolled over to my grandmother and with 3-year-old unconcerned lisped, "Sariyer," and I was terrified that he would remember something of this morning's conversation, some isolated word perhaps, that would tell my grandmother everything. Perhaps I looked anxious, for she suddenly said to me, "What is wrong?" And I sulkily replied that nothing was wrong, and Mehmed, with infinite baby cunning, perhaps scenting that something out of the ordinary was in the wind, plucked at her sleeve, reiterating insistently, "Mehmed cried, Mehmed cried." And when she would not take any notice of him, for she did not know the dangerous thing he was trying to tell her, he pulled at her skirt in a gust of temper. "Cried," he said to her, but she freed herself from his grasp, and my mother's arrival with coffee distracted everyone's attention. My grandmother drank her coffee as if it were poison, and kept making obscure references to Sariyer and Uncle Ahmed, until I thought my mother would faint with the effort to suppress the truth. Once she almost gave herself away, for she indiscreetly mentioned that she was thinking of going to the War Office to see if they could give any news of my father. Naturally, my grandmother pounced on this, demanding to know who had been putting such ideas into my mother's head. The latter replied rather vaguely that nobody had said anything, that she just thought of the idea herself. My grandmother looked at her fixedly. "Sevke," she accused, "you are keeping something from me." Her perception seemed to us uncanny, and even though my mother protested that she had nothing to keep back from anyone, still she warned me with her eyes to take Mehmed to a corner where we could play, and from where we would not likely be given away any secrets. For he was determined to attract my grandmother's attention, would not leave her side, and when she was leaving, beamed at her proudly, saying very distinctly, "Dead, dead." But my grandmother, strangely enough, had no idea of the frightful thing he meant, and my mother interrupted Mehmed's words so smoothly that her gruesomeness was unnoticed. But perhaps she remembered their message later, for we did not see her for a few days, and then, when she did come, there was such a wailing and gnashing of teeth as there never has been in the world before. Her visit did not start like that, of course. In fact, it started remarkably normally, with my grandmother sweeping in to demand coffee, very controlled even though a little red about the eyes. My mother just looked at her incredulously for a moment or two, then said, "You've been to Sariyer." And then everything happened at once. My grandmother's face crumbled. She began to cry, but not silently as Hassan had done, but noisily and desperately, as though a great well was suddenly finding release. Her tears and her ugly, working face frightened me, and I held tightly to my mother's hand, for never had the world seemed so full of tears as latterly. These last weeks had been steeped in tears. The world had become a grim place, where people lost their homes and died in unknown places, where women struggled and grew irritable and wept. The appalling sorrows of the moment weighed me down. I started to cry too. When peace had been more or less restored, by the application of sharp words from my mother and still sharper slaps, Mehmed and I were sent to our corner and commanded to play. As if we could play when the pandemonium of my grandmother's tears filled the room. She wept unceasingly, as though she shed tears not only for her own son that day, but for all humanity. After a long time she stopped. My mother pressed cognac on her, forcing her to drink it. There was little affection in my mother's attitude towards her, for these two were never known to much affection. Yet that day they clung very closely, each depending upon the other for strength to bear these blows from life. At last my grandmother said, "My son is dead, my daughter Aisha is dead, and I have nobody left in the world." "Aisha?" asked my mother in a disbelieving voice, perhaps feeling affronted that my grandmother had regarded her as a nobody. But my grandmother could not answer. She only rocked her body to and fro in an extremity of grief for her eldest born, who was dead. She was almost incoherent with her great grief, and Aisha's death appearing a mere incidental in the face of this larger, more suffocating grief. But eventually my mother extracted the whole story. It ran something like this. My grandmother had left our house dissatisfied with my mother's explanation of Hassan's visit. She had brooded over it all day, finally recollecting Mehmed's abortive attempts to tell her something she became sure which was connected with Sariyer. After a sleepless night, she had arisen the next morning, determined to go to Sariyer immediately. She had informed her astonished husband of this, taken a maid as a chaperone, for whereas she might visit us unescorted, to journey alone as far as Sariyer was quite another matter, and had feverishly hurried to the boat. Upon arrival at Sariyer, she had been met by red-eyed servants, the sight of whom had further increased her alarm, and they told her that Aunt Aisha had died early that morning. My grandmother bore up reasonably well under this news, and thought her deep, urgent sense of premonition had come from this. She had liked Aunt Aisha, but after all she was only a daughter-in-law, and the women of old Turkey did not attach a great deal of importance to such a relationship. Nobody at that time mentioned my uncle, and as a consequence, not knowing of the greater shock that lay before her, my grandmother, although feeling sorrow at Aunt Aisha's untimely death, nevertheless was able competently to take charge of the situation. My aunt had died as the result of a violent hemorrhage, which a doctor, had he been available, would have been unable to check. All this was explained to her by the doctor, who had been afterwards called by the terrified servants who had waited in the house for my grandmother's arrival. He had been startled to hear that no message had been received by her from Sariyer, and that her presence here now was pure chance, due to her alarming premonition that something had been wrong. They had sat and talked in the silent, sun-drenched salon that looked out over the gardens of Sariyer, now at their most beautiful. The salon had affected my grandmother unbearably, for it looked so ready for occupation, as though it awaited the steps of its mistress. Great jars of white lilac, gathered by Aunt Aisha the day before, stood about on little tables, overpowering the still room with its cloying sweet perfume. Later in the morning a notary arrived to explain that Sariyer and all its land and farms now reverted back to Aunt Aisha's family, to a brother who was a cavalry officer away at the war. He had patiently explained to my grandmother's misunderstanding face that Aunt Aisha had died intestate and after Uncle Ahmed. Therefore, according to the law, the property would go to any members remaining from her family. This was the first intimation my grandmother had received that her beloved son was dead, and she had promptly fainted. But when she had been revived, though still stunned by this terrible news, she had been able to arrange about the burial of my aunt, dismiss servants, all of them bewildered and wondering where to go, for they had preferred the servitude of Sariyer to the doubtful freedom of being alone. She had arranged that all the furniture should be shrouded, and finally, that same afternoon, seen Aunt Aisha lowered into her lonely grave, for burial is swift in Turkey, the summer climate being unkind to the newly dead. Then she had bade farewell to Sariyer, lovely under the June sun, empty now and tenantless, with only the fading memory of her laughter to echo now, and then in ghostly fashion. And my grandmother had returned to Istanbul, seeing no beauty now in the lovely sweeping lines of the Bosphorus shore, anxious only to come to my mother to cry her heart out. So she sat in her chair all through the day, and rocked herself to and fro, and when the great tide of grief was exhausted, the sun was far down the sky, the first evening yogurt dew coming up the street. My grandmother moved her stiffened, weary body and prepared to go to her home. Her face was grey and brittle looking, and I do not think that anything else in her life ever hurt her again as much as this, the loss of her favourite, her best loved.